Years now, Democrats and some low IQ stooges in the Republican Party have been telling us it's our moral obligation, it's our duty as Americans to support the nation of Ukraine in its battles against Russia. Now, why Ukraine? Well, because the president's son was paid $1 million a year by Ukraine, and they have a massive lobbying effort in Washington. No, but that's not the reason. There's another much deeper foundational reason. The reason is Ukraine is a democracy. Russia is a dictatorship. It's autocratic. Therefore, all good people support the democracy over the autocracy. Right? Right. Everyone's been telling us that. Adam Kinzinger crying again the other day. Oh, it's a democracy. So it's worth looking into, like, what exactly is Ukraine like? What's its government like? Well, it turns out it's not a democracy. It's run by a dictator who's friends with everyone in Washington. Doesn't make him less of a dictator. How do you know he's a dictator? Because the main opposition figure is now under arrest, and the opposition media, the TV stations, have been shut down by the government. That's not how a democracy operates. That's how a dictatorship operates. And it should make you very nervous that Joe Biden and Susan Rice and that National Security Advisor kid, they're all telling us with a straight face, Liz Cheney too, it's a democracy. So none of this escaped the attention of Richard Hanania. He's president of the Center for the Study of Partisanship. He wrote a really interesting piece today on this on Twitter. We're happy to have him join us tonight. Richard, thanks so much for coming on. So it's a democracy. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to weigh in this. No country that jails its opposition leader and shuts down opposition media is a democracy, in my view. But the Biden administration seems kind of like it's running Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you look, anytime the foreign policy establishment wants to get Americans involved in a conflict, they always, present certain facts and not others. So we can do a dozen different segments on different misrepresentations of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. And I think that most people understand that the U.S. has no real national security interest in Ukraine. Ukraine has been part of Russia throughout history, and sometimes it's not been. That's never mattered for Americans. And so what they rely on is a sort of moral argument. We're the people who think that democracy is hanging on by a thread in the United States, they tell us we have to stand up for democracy in Ukraine against authoritarian Russia. So accepting their premise, let's just sort of talk a little bit about what modern Ukraine is like. In 2014, the current iteration of Ukraine, they came to power in basically the new government came to power in a coup that overthrew a democratically elected government. Nobody denies this. And how have they been behaving in the last 8 years since? In 2019, they had a presidential election. Zelensky, the current president, won. The former president, Poroshenko, has been accused of treason and put under house arrest. They also had parliamentary elections. Zelensky's party was the biggest winner there, but then they went after the second biggest party. They shut down their TV stations. They seized the assets of the biggest financial backer of the party. Ukraine also, in recent years, shut down the biggest social media site in the country. Basically, think the Russian equivalent of Facebook. That's just taken completely off the internet. They've passed language laws that now say you can't be educated in Russian, and also that basically national media cannot be printed in Russian anymore. With some technicalities, but basically everyone recognizes that this is going to end Russian language media on a national scale. And so you can imagine if after 2020 Biden comes into office, he puts Trump under arrest. He goes after the main donors of the Republican Party. He shuts down Fox News and conservative media. Shuts down Facebook and Twitter because that's where conservatives congregate. Shuts down, say, Spanish language media in Florida because the people who use that language, are against Biden. Would anyone on earth think that this was a government behaving democratically? Absolutely not. And so it's not a question of whether Russia or Ukraine is perfect. It's a question of whether Ukraine matters to the United States, whether Ukraine is such a morally upstanding country that it's worth the U.S. poisoning its relations with another superpower, the only country in the world that is basically a peer competitor as far as number of nuclear weapons, potentially bringing it into NATO and going to war for Ukraine. What is it, what is it about Ukraine? Ukraine has to be basically saintly for the United States for it to be to be worth American blood or treasure. You can even say, even if it was, who cares what happens in Eastern Europe? That's none of our business. But if you're going to rely on this idea that it's a democracy, you have to look at Ukraine as it actually is, and it's nowhere close to democracy. It's nobody's definition of a democracy. This is reported in American media, although it gets underplayed.
I think it's the kind of democracy that they'd like to see here. Maybe that's the point. For more on what Ukraine is like and for more on why our current establishment loves Ukraine, you should check out Richard Hanania's Substack.